皆さん、来週の日曜日はタマさんの誕生日です。まず、誰がケーキを作りますか？はい、私が作ります。次、誰が DJ をしますか？じゃあ私がやります。タマさん、誕生日おめでとうございます。すごいですね。誰が作りましたか？私が作りました。皆さん、こんにちは。In this video, we'll learn the general functions of the ga particle and introduce one of the hard rules of ga. We'll go over some scenarios that explain the difference between wa and ga. Then you'll see some useful examples, and at the end of the video, you can try some quizzes. Let's get started. As many textbooks explain, the ga particle marks the subject of a sentence. For example, in the sentence, Shiro is a leader, the subject is Shiro. So we mark it with ga, and we get Shiro ga leader desu. Now you might be wondering about the wa particle. Why not say Shiro wa leader desu? We will discuss that soon, but first, let's review what the subject of a sentence is. In the second sentence, Shiro bought a house. Shiro is again the subject. So we say, Shiro ga ie o kaimashita. In the sentence, this is a Dragon Ball. The subject is this. So we say, これがドラゴンボールです。Now let's compare the basic functions of wa and ga. The basic difference is that wa marks the topic of a sentence, while ga marks the subject. However, sometimes a subject can also be the topic of a sentence, and that's when it becomes confusing which one to use. So the general rule is that when wa marks the subject that is also the topic of a sentence, what comes after wa is more important than the subject itself. On the other hand, when ga marks the subject is the main point of the sentence. So what comes before ga is important. Next, we'll go over some scenarios and learn how the meaning or the nuance changes between wa and ga. Let's consider a scenario where someone asks, what is Shiro's role? We know Shiro is a leader, so the answer would be, Shiro is a leader, or even just leader, because that's the main point. So in this case, we use wa and say, Shiro wa leader desu. Now imagine someone asks, who is the leader? The answer would be, Shiro is the leader, or simply Shiro, because that's the main point in this context. This time we mark the subject with ga and say, Shiro ga leader desu. By using ga, we emphasize Shiro, making it sound like Shiro is the leader. Notice that we mark the subject with wa when the subject is simply a topic and the main point is not the subject itself. However, we mark the subject with ga when the subject itself is the main point. Next, let's consider a scenario where someone asks, what did Shiro do? We know that Shiro bought a house, so the answer would be Shiro bought a house, or simply bought a house, because that's the main point. In this case, we use wa and say Shiro wa ie o kaimashita. Now imagine a situation where we're talking about Shiro's recent purchase of a new home. A friend joins the conversation late and learns that someone bought a house, but isn't sure who. So the person asks, who bought a house? The answer would be, Shiro bought a house, or simply Shiro, because that's the main point. In this case, we use ga and say, Shiro ga ie o kaimashita. Again, notice that we mark the subject Shiro with wa when the subject is just the topic. However, we mark the subject shiro with ga when the subject itself is the main point. Let's see one more example. Imagine a situation where someone sees a mysterious ball and asks, "What is this?" You know that it's a Dragon Ball, so you would respond with, "This is a Dragon Ball," or simply Dragon Ball. So in this case, you would say, これはドラゴンボールです. Now imagine a scenario where there are different kinds of balls in front of us, and we know there's something called a Dragon Ball, but we don't know which one it is. So someone asks, which one is a Dragon Ball? If you know the answer, you would say, this is a Dragon Ball, or simply this. So in this case, it would be これがドラゴンボールです. To summarize the basic functions of wa and ga, wa marks the topic and ga marks the subject. When wa marks the subject that is also the topic of the sentence, what comes after wa is the main point of the sentence. When ga marks the subject itself is the main point. Next, we'll learn how to use the ga particle in subject questions. Let's say we're discussing a workplace and we want to know who is performing the lead role. So we ask this question, who is the leader? This is a subject question, meaning that it's asking about the subject of the sentence. In the subject question, we always mark the question word with ga. In this example, the question word is who, 誰. So, who is the leader is 誰がリーダーですか? Please note that we never mark question words with wa because something we don't know cannot be a topic of conversation. Now, shiro is the leader is the answer to this subject question. When responding to a subject question, we mark the subject with ga. So, 白がリーダーです is how we answer this question, which sounds like 白 is the leader, with emphasis on the subject, 白. Let's imagine a scenario where we know that someone bought a house, but we're not sure who did. So we want to ask who bought a house. Again, this is a subject question because we're asking about the subject. So we mark the question word with ga and say 誰が家を買いましたか? Now, Shiro bought a house is the answer to this subject question. So we mark the subject with ga and say シロが家を買いました, which sounds like Shiro bought a house or Shiro is the one who bought a house. Let's do one more example. Imagine we see many kinds of balls in front of us, and one of them is supposed to be something called a Dragon Ball, but we don't know which one it is. So we want to ask which one is a Dragon Ball. And again, this is a subject question. And the question word is which one, どれ. So we mark the question word with ga and say どれがドラゴンボールですか? Now, this one is a Dragon Ball is the answer to the subject question. So we mark the subject with ga and say これがドラゴンボールです, which sounds like this one is a Dragon Ball. To summarize how to use ga in subject questions, when asking about the subject of a sentence, we mark the question word with ga, and when responding to a subject question, we mark the subject with ga. Please note that there are more functions of ga, but we will not be covering all of them in this video. The link to the video that covers more details about the ga particle will be added to the description as soon as it becomes ready. For now, we'll focus on the basic functions of ga and how it's used in subject questions. So let's see more examples and make sure we fully understand the basics before getting into more advanced concepts. Let's see more examples. Which one is your recommendation? どれがおすすめですか? どれがおすすめですか? This one is my recommendation. It's popular. これがおすすめです。人気ですよ。これがおすすめです。人気ですよ。Which painting is the most famous? どの絵が一番有名ですか? どの絵が一番有名ですか? This painting is the most famous. この絵が一番有名ですよ。この絵が一番有名ですよ。Who painted this painting? 誰がこの絵を描きましたか? 誰がこの絵を描きましたか? Leonardo da Vinci painted. レオナルド・ダ・ヴィンチが描きました。レオナルド・ダ・ヴィンチが描きました。Now let's try some quizzes. Which is the correct phrase for who is waiting? Is it 誰が待っていますか? or 誰は待っていますか? The correct answer is 誰が待っていますか? Remember, we mark the question word with が when asking about the subject. Also remember that we never mark a question word with は. Which is the correct phrase for who are you waiting for? Is it 誰が待っていますか? or 誰を待っていますか? This one is a bit tricky. We know that Shiro is waiting for someone, and we want to know who she is waiting for. So the correct answer is 誰を待っていますか? In this case, we're asking about the object. So we simply mark the object 誰 with the object marker, which is the お particle. Which is the correct phrase for who is getting married? Is it 誰と結婚しますか? or 誰が結婚しますか? The correct answer is 誰が結婚しますか? We're asking who the subject is, who is getting married. Please note that 誰と結婚しますか would mean with whom is the person going to marry. Which is the correct phrase for what is the most difficult thing in Japanese? Is it 日本語で何が一番難しいですか? or 日本語で何は一番難しいですか? The correct answer is 日本語で何が一番難しいですか? Again, we're asking about the subject. Next, can you say who said I am your father? The answer is 誰が I am your father と言いましたか? 誰が I am your father と言いましたか? Now, how do you say Darth Vader said as a response to who said I am your father? The answer is ダース・ベイダーが言いました。ダース・ベイダーが言いました。Today we learned the basic functions of が and how to use が in a question sentence. Thank you for watching. ありがとうございます。